The sealed bag split under Brother Matthew's thumbnail, and something inside turned its face toward him. Fear tightened his hands around the strip of vellum. His apprentice, Elise, hissed and stepped back. The object was a token of bone and copper, wrapped in oilcloth and bound with wax. It had been labeled, catalogued, and entrusted to him, but it moved. Matthew's fear shaped his decisions from that moment on. Catalogue the motion, describe its axis, control the unknown. Brother Matthew set the oilcloth aside with 2 patient fingers. He wiped his ink, stained thumb on his habit, and forced his breath into regular counts. The cold light from the single sconce cut the scriptorium in hard lines. The rest of the room was a stacked dark of closed chests and leaning ladders. He pressed the token flat on the table and tapped it with the quill. It did not slide away. Elise's hand hovered over her mortar and pestle. Knuckles white. Matthew, she said. It turned. Matthew named the problem aloud. It turned when the wax came loose. He pushed his chair back to measure distance, to mark a scale on the ledger. Outside, bells had not yet woken the dormitory. Inside, concern arrived quickly. Prior Alaric's runner knocked twice and entered with a paper mandate. The prior's voice was low, clipped. Brother Matthew, the house requires an ordered register of infernal phenomena. You will compile it. The mandate turned the scriptorium from an archive into a project under command. Matthew's suspicion that his collection mattered mutated into a duty shaped by hierarchy. Ordering the uncanny would be the monastery's work, and Matthew's hands would do the ordering. He read the prior's words at the long bench and felt the ledger sway, as if it were an accusation. Prior Alaric watched him fold the mandate and set it beneath a jar of powdered lampblack. We name and contain. Alaric, that is authority. Matthew answered with a small bow and a clearer sentence. I will inventory each object and draw each plate. His voice held calm. Elise's shoulders loosened when she heard the plan. She interpreted duty as a structure that would keep things safe. They began by unwrapping the simple things. Suit, stained charms, a bag of sharpened bone teeth, a scorched ribbon embroidered with crude sigils. For each, Matthew produced a vellum plate. A small, measured drawing, marginal notes, and a set of traits listed in neat columns. He taught Elise how to set a baseline. Length, curvature, reaction to flame, reaction to holy water, associated marks. He made her trace repeated strokes so their hands would match. Measure the socket width, he said. Count the notches. Elise did it, murmuring the numbers in a steady voice. Their work felt like surgery on the unknown. At midday, with the scriptorium lit by a burned-down lamp and a thin grey light through the high window, Brother Matthew discovered a repeating mark across different sketches. He held up 2 plates and pointed. See this pattern. A small crescent beside the left winged limb. Elise leaned in, breathing shallowly. She traced the mark with a fingertip. The pattern repeated like a rule. Matthew's suspicion bent toward a hypothesis. A taxonomic mark, a shared trait among otherwise unlike specimens. He felt a small exhilaration at pattern recognition, then a steadying caution. Pattern implied predictability. Predictability implied control. Canon Renaud arrived in the late afternoon with his sleeves tucked and his chin set. He examined the ledger as if it were scripture and spoke with a tone that mapped doctrine onto method. Brother Matthew Renaud. The line between catalogue and catechism is thin. Do you propose that these plates supplant doctrine? Matthew placed his fingertips on the vellum. No, Canon. I propose we annotate scripture so the brothers know how to act when these things present themselves. Renaud's eyes narrowed. Annotation can breed arrogance. The house must frame your lists within proper theology, or the catalogue becomes a manual for danger. He withdrew a rubric of rules and set it beside the ledger. The monastery's authority bent the catalogue toward an instrument of control rather than pure knowledge. Matthew felt the project's purpose change under Renaud's scrutiny. The initial fear had shifted into guarded resolve. He worked with the ledger as if it were a patient that needed delicate sutures. He organized plates into folders, sewed tags onto specimen jars, tied wax seals over sample bags. Elise labeled each tag in a smaller hand. Specimen C17 rotative token. Specimen D4 inked plate anomalous. They recorded measurements in columns that matched Renaud's rubric and the Prius mandate. The work required meticulous motion. Measure, draw, note, seal. As dusk settled and the lamp flames guttered, Matthew set to copy an older plate that had once been treated as a diagram. He measured the horn to hilt ratio and marked the angle on the vellum. The ink line qualified the form. He paused and ran a fine brush along the curve to test the weight. The curve shifted under the brush. The inked features rearranged by a hair's breadth. Matthew's breath held. His fingers made a small, involuntary retreat. Elise exhaled sharply. She touched the page with the pad of a finger and felt warmth, as if the ink had just cooled. The plate refused to be pinned. Matthew's emotions moved again, from suspicion to alarm. He checked the sample bag's original tag, compared the catalog entry, and saw a mismatch in marginalia. A different clerk had annotated the plate decades prior with a shortened mark Matthew did not recognize. He tapped the ledger with his quill and said, "Elise, fetch the binding wax and the small bell." She moved with quick steps and returned rubbing a stained square of beeswax and a brass bell on its cord. Matthew set the bell down and rang it once over the plate. The sound was a single, hollow note that rode the rafters and stopped the room's small noises. Canon Renaud watched from the doorway and folded his arms. "Write the protocol," he demanded. "Describe the action to bind this anomaly." "I will authorize only ritualized containment that fits doctrine," Renaud demand pushed the ledger toward performative legitimacy. Matthew's sphere turned into a decision to ritualize classification. If the house would not accept a raw ledger, he would dress it in protocol. They held a small ceremony in the scribe's private stall later that evening. Elise steadied the ledger while Matthew inscribed a binding notation. A precise sigil, a scale of measures, and a rubric on how to restrain movement. Canon Renaud dictated a phrase to close the notation within doctrinal language. "This is to ensure obedience of the specimen," he said. Matthew inked the closing line and pressed wax over the seam. His hand trembled once and then steadied. The action felt like stitching a wound closed. The ritual was a compromise, naming the anomaly as a specimen while subjecting it to ecclesiastical language. After the ritual, they replaced the plate on the bench and withdrew. The room grew colder. Their command over the object seemed to settle for a time. Matthew's resolution moved toward wary vigilance. He slept badly that night, his fingers curling around the ledger's corner as if holding it in place. Elise sat in a chair near the door, eyelids heavy with exhaustion, watchful and silent. The prior inspected the wax seal at dawn and nodded once. But the ledger would not remain passively bound. At midnight, when the brothers counted their breaths and the scriptorium held only candle, hallow and ink, scent, the plate reacted in a way none had measured. Brother Matthew returned to the bench to make a final notation. He bent over the vellum, quill poised, light striking the curve of his nose, and as he inscribed the last tiny stroke, the inked illustration lifted from the page. A thin, inky silhouette rose, curling at the fingers like drying paint. It crawled across the bench. Elise gasped and smacked her palm against the table. "Matthew!" she cried. Canon Renaud lunged forward, overturning a stool. "Hold it," he barked. In 3 quick motions, the 3 of them attempted containment. Matthew slammed a folio over the plate. Renaud thrust the bell and clapped the seal. Elise grabbed the ledger and tried to fold the page. Their actions were precise, practiced to the point of ritual. The inked silhouette lashed like a small animal and struck for the parchment, leaving a smear on the folio that burned the paper slightly and left a dark scent of ozone. Lines of rapid dialogue broke the room into controlled commands. "Matthew, the folio!" Renaud ordered. "Elise, the lamp! Extinguish it!" Elise extinguished the lamp, plunging the scriptorium into a tighter darkness, relieved only by a single candle's flame. "Back away!" Matthew, back. He pressed the folio down with both hands. The silhouette pressed beneath and scraped toward the ledger's spine like a beetle under bark. It exhaled a smell of old iron and copper. Matthew's jaw clenched. His voice was thin. "Hold steady," he said, counting to himself. The attack shifted their understanding. What had been a specimen behaved as predator. The ledger became a battlefield. Canon Renaud slammed the bell against the folio, and the sound shattered the scraping. The silhouette recoiled, and then flattened like a smear only to reform at the margin. Elise reached into her apron for a vial marked with a small cross and sprinkled a few drops of holy water. The liquid spat and hissed on contact. The ink silhouette shrieked in a sound that was not entirely animal and not entirely air. It retreated into a hairline fissure in the page and then vanished. After the confrontation, they worked without ceremony. They scraped the felled smear with a bone spatula. They copied the damaged plate onto a clean sheet. Matthew's hands were clipped with cut marks and ink scars. Renaud paced and issued orders that bent the situation into policy, even as his eyes betrayed a shaken face. "Seal the infected plates separately," he said. "No brother may consult them without supervision." Prior Alaric arrived before dawn and listened. He weighed the notes and, with the austere face he kept for administration, declared, "We will seal the ledger. We will write containment protocols to be archived under lock. The catalogue is now a matter of house security. The decision redistributed power. Classification would justify secrecy. In the archive cell, heavy with iron and the smell of old glue, they placed the ledger into an oak chest. Elise tucked the damaged plates into a folded cloth and tied the bundle with string. She hesitated and then wrote a single line in the ledger's margin in a small, cramped hand. Then she folded that scrap of vellum and slipped it beneath the ledger's strap. "Why hide notes?" "Renaud, we must prevent panic. Prior Alaric, we preserve what is necessary." Elise pressed the folded note beneath the strap with a thumb and said, "Because not everything should be lost to forgetfulness." Her tone was quick and not rhetoric. It read as a deliberate, private motion. Matthew watched Elise act and felt a stirring that was not purely fear. He felt guilt and a new kind of resolve. The emotional thread moved again, alarm to guarded determination, then to protective secrecy. He stood and placed his palm against the chest's lid. He felt the grain of the wood and the metal cold at the hasp. He saw how the catalogue had been transmuted from an intellectual project into an instrument of authority and control. He had started as one who measured strange things to prevent harm. Now he realized the ledger itself held power over others who would read and act on its contents. They hammered the iron hasp shut and fixed 2 seals to the strap. The prior signed the official record and gave each of them a copy of the new protocol. Elise lingered at the chest longer than the others. "Matthew," she whispered, "what if they come for the ledger later?" He turned to her and kept his voice small. "Then we will make sure they have the right reasons to open it." He did not mean performative doctrine. He meant the ledger should protect the brothers by guiding action, not by permitting spectacle. His hands still shook when he finished the phrase. Outside, a watchman walked the cloister with his staff and keys. Inside, the archive room returned to a low, bureaucratic hum. Instructions filed, seals recorded, signatures taken. The catalogue's dangerous life had been contained physically, but its implications were not sealed. Matthew understood that lists could make a thing real in the minds of those who read them. Names and measurements could create expectations that shaped fear and action. The ledger would survive as an instrument of power, and power would shape what others believed. Elise slipped a marginalia note into her sleeve before she left the archive. She took one last look at Matthew. "Brother Matthew," she said aloud, "promise me you will keep the ledger true to its purpose." He met her eyes and answered, "I will record what is seen, not what is feared." His promise held an edge of doubt. He could not be certain how the house would use the ledger tomorrow or in a year. The narrator, An observer who had traced these events into a later record closed the chapter on that night with a single concrete image. The oak chest lid dropping and the iron hasp sliding into place. The sound of the lock was small and hard. Elise pressed the folded vellum beneath the leather strap before the hasp could take all that paper. The room exhaled into routine. Outside, the bells called the brothers to work. Inside, a note waited hidden, a record of a decision that had not been authorized by the house, and the catalogue, sealed and dangerous, began its life as both tool and secret. The ledger's sealed status altered the monastery's procedures. The prior circulated a brief. Any consultation of the ledger required 2 witnesses, a confession of purpose, and a recorded outcome. Canon Renaud drafted those lines and signed them in a thick hand. Matthew filled the first permitted form and noted every step. He wrote how the token had first moved, how they had performed binding, and how the silhouette had crawled from the plate. He described the smell of copper and ozone, the bell's hollow ring, the way the vellum had resisted. He avoided conjecture and wrote only actions and observations. His discipline was both ethical and practical. He believed clear description reduced chaos. Yet secrecy bred curiosity in the brothers. A sullen novice asked once if the ledger recorded sin or sickness, another whether the plates might be used as charms. Matthew answered each question with precise language and set them to tasks. Fetch vellum, mend a torn folio, sort labels. He used work to channel speculation. Elise read his decisions as careful containment. She offered practical help and the small rebellions of a young mind, staining a page to test whether ink would re-form, leaving a pinprick in a sample bag to see if air moved. Each experiment risked exposure, and each risk shaped their choices. Weeks later, an old marginal mark from an earlier scribe surfaced as a clue. Matthew found a shortened line under a plate that had once shifted. The mark suggested an origin, a visiting monk known for working with odd materials. The discovery reframed earlier assumptions about provenance. Matthew confronted Prior Alaric with the name, Prior. The mark points to Brother Lucian, who left the house 20 years ago. Alaric frowned. Brother Lucian recorded too many things. We removed his papers then because they caused trouble. Elise leaned forward. Then someone knew before us, she said. Someone tried to catalogue and failed. Renaud's hand tightened on his pen. Then we must be more exact than those before us, he said. The twist changed how Matthew interpreted the token's behavior. It suggested that the catalogue had been attempted and had become dangerous in other hands. It forced him to consider motive and legacy. Classification could be an honest attempt to protect or a tool of control. His choices hardened again. He doubled the ledger's notations, referenced earlier records, and added a column for provenance. He wrote Brother Lucian's name in the margins and underlined it once. At the chapter's close, the archive chest remained shut. The prior left instructions to re-evaluate the ledger after 3 months. Canon Renaud assigned 2 brothers to guard the chest during canonical hours. Elise returned one night to the storage room and, while no one watched, slid her folded note from beneath the strap and tucked it into her sleeve. She had written a single observation she feared the house might erase, an invocation found in a marginal hand that contradicted doctrine. She had not yet shown it to Matthew. Matthew left the archive with a copy of the day's log under his arm and a ledger of measures in his satchel. He walked past the cloister and stopped at the scriptorium threshold. He looked back once and touched the lintel as if to test whether the building itself would remember what had occurred. Then he went to his stall and set his quill down. His hands bore the small dark stains of ink and a thin scar on his jaw where work had once caught his skin. He had done what he could within the rules given to him, and the catalogue had become both shield and secret. The chapter ends with a concrete beat. Elise, alone in the dim corridor, pressed the folded marginalia into the hollow of the chest lid and slid back into the shadow before the brother on watch could notice. The watchman's footsteps receded. The iron hasp caught and the seal held. In the quiet that followed, Matthew sharpened a quill and began a new page of measurements, his breath steadying as he wrote the ledger's next line. Brother Matthew split the wax at the seam and the bone token tipped, exposing a tiny carved eye that turned toward the room. Fear lodged in his hands, and he did not let the strip of vellum fall. Elise stepped back and hissed at the movement. "Put it down, Prior Henry," his voice hard, and the other clerics obeyed without looking at the token. Within 3 breaths the demonstration became an argument about control. Who would record it? Who would contain it? Who would name it? The immediate problem was clear. What they called a specimen might not be inert, and that decision would decide who kept power over the ledger. Brother Matthew had catalogued objects before. He had opened bundles, placed labels, and written plates until his fingers were stained with iron ink. He kept a ledger and a bronze amulet at his belt. He had pried a wax seal 2 nights earlier and split the oilcloth that hid the token. The memory of that seam was still under his thumbnail. Here, under the scriptorium chandeliers, he felt fear sharpen into something like obligation. The house expected order. He reached for tools because order was his trained answer. Prior Henry stood with his palms flat on the demonstration table, his robe neat despite the candle soot on his sleeves. "Matthew," he said, "we will complete the entry. Secure the sample." His tone left little space for refusal. Elise held the small magnifier on a cord and kept her thumb over the lens, as if blocking the image from reaching her eye. Master Laurent sat to the side with a folded sheet and a lamp and watched their hands instead of the token. That inspection, this demand to label and file, established the house's claim. Matthew felt suspicion before he could name it. The token's carved eye had a mechanic's blink, not the slow closing of a creature. He touched the ink stains on his fingers and moved to set the specimen on a plain plate. "Master Laurent," he said, "compare it to the older plates. I will draw a first pass." Laurent pushed himself forward and said, "Bring the ledger. If this is part of a known family, we must not reclassify without cause." The exchange shifted the room into the scriptorium's ritual rhythm. Draw, compare, write. They worked through the night. The narration that records these actions notes the house procedures, but the story stays close to what Matthew did. He tied vellum to a board, set a lamp, and bent his back to copy the lines. The first emotional motion was suspicion. The second was fear. When Matthew's quill hesitated, his hand trembled and ink spattered a small, dark star on the page. Elisa's voice rose in a whisper. "Brother Matthew, the margin," and she pointed to a smear that had not been there before. An early external event changed the trajectory. A visiting scholar, Master Laurent, removed a torn folio and held it under the lamp. He compared the specimen's drawn horn with a plate from the prior century. "This does not match, Laurent. The old plates place it in no stable rank." His discovery undercut Matthew's attempt at neat classification. Matthew closed his mouth and tapped his quill against his thumb twice, measuring his answer. "We name it for containment, Prior Henry. We reduce the danger by making the ledger speak for us." That phrase, spoken short, brought out the chapter's principal conflict. Classification as control. Matthew believed the same in theory. In practice, he moved in smaller gestures. He wrapped sample bags in oil, sealed them with wax, and wrote a provisional entry. He spoke aloud while he worked. "Bone token, unknown, sized 2, incised eye, seals react to iron ink." Each statement made the object feel smaller to the men at the table. At midnight, Elise bent over a half-drawn plate. She sighed and said, "The marginalia changes, Brother Matthew. Look." Matthew looked and saw lines where none had been. The ink on the margin twisted into a new glyph, while their lamp heated the air above the vellum. He attempted a sigil test that he had practiced in solitude. A quiet rubric drawn in red lead to bind the depiction. He chanted the measured syllables and pressed wax. The pages shivered. A jar of ink toppled and splashed across an unfinished sketch. Elise flinched and clutched her apron. "Prior." It moved again. she said. Her sentence was short. It carried the proof into the open. Henry barked an order. Contain it. Seal the chest. No copies leave the room. The command turned the evening into a division. Some clerics moved to obey. Matthew stayed with the plates until the wax cooled, his hands steadying as he worked the ledger. The emotion shifted from fear to constraint, an attempt to force order back on a thing that resisted. The next event came when they returned after dawn. The sealed chest lay quiet. Matthew ran his fingers over the lock and found new scratches. He opened the lid and found a set of inked sketches that were not there when they sealed the room. Exact copies of the aborted plate, drawn as if by a steady hand. His throat tightened. The discovery raised a new practical question. Had their act of cataloguing altered the specimen, or had the specimen altered the ledger? He folded the vellum and placed it against his chest, as if to weigh the two options. Master Laurent pressed his lips and said, "If the act of drawing changes the object, we are not merely chroniclers. We are makers." That line demanded a decision from the prior. Henry's jaw worked. "We cannot hand power to unknown motions," he answered. "Complete the taxonomic entry. We will bind the sample tighter and note the anomalies." The prior's instruction relied on institutional habit. To bury contradiction under process. At the worktable, Matthew tried an experiment with Elise's help. She held a lamp while he traced a second plate. They tested different pigments. One reagent caused the vellum to darken and the marginal glyph to lengthen by a hair. Each test produced a measurable reaction. The physicality of the experiments grounded the chapter's central fear. Information might not be neutral. When Elise, the ink curls like a tongue, Matthew stopped them and wiped his hands on his apron. He could not speak the word that came to his mouth, control, but he acted to contain. A cliffhanger arrived in the middle of the chapter. As Matthew copied a containment rubric, the inked marginalia crawled toward the newly drawn plate, and the lamp guttered. He muttered the rubric louder, and Elise's hand knocked over a vial. A few drops hit the margin, and the lines bloomed into a small black knot. "It copied our failure," Elise whispered. Everyone looked at the knot. The knot implied a change in stakes. The house's ledger was reactive. That small knot forced them to reconsider whether the ledger served the monks or something else recorded in the pages. Arguments followed. Prior Henry accused Master Laurent of undermining authority by suggesting the plates were unstable. "Laurent, you would not have us ignore the binder who keeps order," Henry demanded. Laurent replied, "I would have us see facts. Facts show these plates contradict your categories. The exchange contained rapid back and forth. You stand with me or the ledger." "Henry, I stand with truth," Laurent answered. The dispute displayed two paths: bury contradiction or re-evaluate the house method. Matthew watched and felt a third motion inside him. Obligation to the ledger versus the knowledge of unforeseen change. That inner conflict produced an outward act. Matthew walked to the locked chest, removed the ledger, and flipped to a section where past entries clustered. He thumbed through annotations and stopped at a page with erased sigils. The physical rasps where ink had been scraped away matched the scratches on the chest lid. He called Elise over. "Look here," he said. "Pages were altered before. The house buried this once already. The revelation changed the room's understanding. This was not the first time the ledger had shifted the balance of knowledge. Someone had already decided to hide inconvenient plates. The chapter's climax arrived at night under a storm. Matthew prepared a binding rubric and placed the finished plate on the table. He read the words aloud and pressed waxed seals along the vellum. The inked plate lay flat for a heartbeat, and then an inky silhouette rose along the page edge and unfolded like a pressed moth. It mirrored Matthew's drawn lines exactly, a dark counter, image that grew a head and shoulders from the vellum. The room erupted. A wax seal snapped, a chandelier swung, and a rain of droplets spattered the table.
Matthew shouted, "Seal it!"
Elise threw her cloak over the plate. Prior Henry lunged for the ledger. They chanted a hurried rubric together in a clumsy line of voices. The silhouette met their words by stretching into a larger outline that matched a taxonomic plate's proportions. It paced the table where the plates sat and bumped ajar. The contact scattered sample bags and unsealed a tiny packet. Henry hit the table until the ledger slid and pages fluttered open like a black fan. The physical collision, books, wax, glass, resolved the immediate contest. Containment versus emergence. The gesture that settled the moment was not a speech. Elise seized a cold iron implement from Matthew's belt and struck the silhouette's spread on the vellum with the blunt end. The sound was a hollow clack and the figure shuddered. Matthew pressed his palm to the plate and whispered a rubric with more control than before. The silhouette folded and sank back into the ink as the wax cooled. The emergency ended by concrete action. Struck metal, pressed palm binding words. The clerics breathed hard and moved to salvage scattered items. In the aftermath, Prior Henry ordered immediate removal of damaged pages and a new directive. Files with anomalies must be hidden beneath the stairs in the locked chest. The house decides what is dangerous, he said. Henry's choice closed the house's procedural loop. Elise cupped a burned hand and watched Matthew rearrange plates. "Brother Matthew," she said, "your ledger shows scratches again. Who erased them?" Matthew did not answer immediately. He folded a sheet and handed it to her instead. The narrator notes that Matthew found several entries on the official vellum missing or shifted, lines erased, categories altered. He located a faint erased sigil on the margin that the cleaning could not remove. Matthew pressed his thumb onto the symbol and felt a tiny warmth despite the pre-dawn air. He looked at the prior and said nothing. The decision to hide pages had been made, and at the center of it lay a single residual mark. An erased shape that refused to be fully erased. In the final sequence, the prior carried the damaged ledger beneath the stairs and sealed the chest with a new lock. Elise tidied scattered jars and placed small waxed tags on sample bags. Master Laurent collected his lamp and left with measured steps. Matthew stayed last at the table and wrote a short note in the margin. Observed reactions. Containment incomplete. He signed it in a hand that trembled less than earlier. He slid the ledger into the chest and closed the lid. As he turned the key, Matthew heard the faint scraping of a nib on vellum from inside the locked chest. He paused, hand on the key, and heard nothing else. He slid the key back through the ring and walked to the stair. The final image is concrete. Prior Henry descending with the chest, Elise holding her bandaged hand, Matthew standing beneath the lamp with ink on his fingers. The erased sigil remained visible on the topmost page. The chapter ends with the physical beat of a locked door and the scraped sound that came from behind it as the house resolved its immediate crisis and buried the evidence within its vault. Emotion root. Fear guided the choices here, fear that naming might create, fear that the ledger could claim authority, fear that hiding would not erase consequence. Emotion shifts move from suspicion to fear, then to constraint, then to urgency, and finally to a brittle acceptance that the house would hide what did not fit. The scribe who first opened the oilcloth leaves the room carrying both a ledger of names and the knowledge that the act of cataloging changed the thing it recorded. This chapter resolves the immediate conflict. The public demonstration that began in shock concludes with the prior's order to conceal. The characters made choices. Matthew chose to bind and record. Elise chose to act with a blunt iron. Laurent chose to speak truth at the cost of authority. And Henry chose institutional concealment. The story leaves a residue. A faint erased sigil on the official ledger, and the sound of a nib continuing work behind a locked door. A concrete sign that the ledger had already been altered once, and would likely be altered again. The narrator, keeping records, notes the small facts that remain. The burned bandage on Elise's hand, the ragged edge of a plate where ink had bloomed, the bronze amulet at Matthew's belt. Those items linked to what happened earlier. The sealed bags split under Brother Matthew's thumbnail, and bind this chapter to what will follow. The chapter closes on a specific action. Prior Henry bears the chest to the stair and locks the door, and Matthew pauses with his hand on the key, listening for any sound from within the sealed darkness. Prior Henry slammed the ledger onto the table, and the vellum fell open. The grid of inked specimens stared back at the chapter. Fear tightened Matthew's fingers on his quill and made the ink tremble along the seam. The assembled brothers shifted on hard benches. Elise stood half behind Matthew, her hand pressed to the cold wood. Within 5 sentences the problem was on the table. The catalogue was no longer a record but a motion of authority. Brother Matthew had written the plates. He had measured horns and sketched limb angles until his eyes blurred. He had split a wax seal months before and handled a small bag that contained bone and copper wrapped in oilcloth. The bag had been labelled and catalogued then, and that earlier act had lodged in his hands like a burned coin. Tonight, he faced his peers with the ledger open, and the chapter waiting for him to explain how a scribe's work had become a tool for punishment. Brother Matthew. Prior Henry, his voice flat and exact. Show them the plate that matches Arnulf. The word Arnulf moved across the room like a command. Matthew swallowed. He traced a finger to a square of ink where a creature's face had been drawn and a short name had been written in a cramped hand. Matthew's first emotion was not a thought but a set of small movements. His shoulders pulled up, his thumb rubbed the scar at his jaw, and he tapped the corner of the page with the quill. That physical tightening preceded the single word he would later call fear. He did not speak yet. The chapter required evidence. Evidence required names. Naming required him. Prior Henry folded his hands. We do not accuse lightly. We have 2 witnesses in the plate. Arnulf will answer in the cloister. He gestured to a younger brother who stepped forward and took Arnulf by the wrist. Arnold lay. Brother Arnulf did not fight. He blinked and traced the grain of the table with his thumb as though to confirm he still touched wood and not the thin edge of a noose. Elise leaned forward, the candlelight catching the wet of her eyes. Brother Matthew, she said, and the name cut the silence. Look at the margins here. She touched the ledger where small notes clustered, handwriting not Matthew's, not Prior Henry's. Small shorthand-tied plates to punishments, short phrases about penances, about sequester, about binding when seen in the field. Matthew read and felt his throat go dry. The margin had been added later. Someone in the chapter had turned the ledger into a manual. Matthew lifted his chin. He spoke in a thin voice. I catalogued. I copied what I was given. His words were measured, the way he had always written. Precise, reluctant to commit beyond the ink. I meant order, not sentence. He did not say he had once cut open a sealed bag and felt the carved eye inside look back at him. He did not need to. Elise had seen him that night when the token turned its face. Henry's jaw moved once. Order is what keeps men from error, he said. Order is what keeps us from being led astray. He did not explain who decided what counted as error. That omission hung in the room and sharpened the air. The first shift came as a low, practical argument. Matthew defended the taxonomy with habit-born logic. Names allow identification, he told them. Without names, we cannot test claims. Without names, we cannot prepare the rites that prevent invasion. We list so that the chapter may act quickly. His hands moved as he spoke, opening and closing the ledger as if measurement itself justified what followed. Elise read aloud one marginal note. For those named who resist, 2 witnesses. For those named who flee, public banishment. For layfolk, swift penance and record. The voice broke on record. Elise's tone was not theatrical. It was the tone of a child who had observed something ruled by adults, and then saw that rule used against someone she liked. Prior Henry's face hardened. These protocols were approved by Prior Anselm. They are meant to secure the house. He fixed Matthew with a small, cold look. Brother Matthew, you hold a tool of the chapter. You made it legible. Take responsibility for it. The chapter watched Matthew as though he had spilled ink on their robes. A second shift arrived when Elise tapped a plate and found a missing tag. "This one is bare," she said. She held up a blank vellum label, still warm from where fingers had pressed wax earlier in the night. "Someone slipped this in after the ledger was bound." Her voice sharpened. "Someone in the chapter intends to name a living man," she did not whisper. The room listened to that sentence as if to the knell of a bell. A silence followed that contained a small, mechanical sound. The candle next to Matthew's elbow sputtered as though a draft had arrived. No one admitted opening a window. Matthew felt his hands go cold. He remembered the sealed bag again, how the bone token had a carved eye that pivoted in its socket when his thumbnail split the wax, and an image rose in his head, clear and specific. The token's eye turned to watch him write a name. That remembered sight became an inner action. He pulled his sleeve down, rubbed the ink from his fingertips on his apron, and tried to steady the quill. Elise pushed a chair back and stood closer to Matthew, who bound that label. She demanded. Her voice shortened into a question that expected a name. "Who will name a man while we sleep? Who will mark a face and call it a threat?" The question spread through the chapter like a scent. It landed on Prior Henry. Henry swallowed. He did not name anyone. He offered instead a defensive argument about preservation and precedent. A short exchange followed, 3 fast lines that snapped at one another. "Prior, we cannot let a ledger become a weapon." "Elise, the ledger is evidence," Henry replied. "Evidence must be verifiable, Matthew." Those 3 lines arrived like a measured examination. They produced no resolution. Instead, they produced action. Prior Henry ordered an audit. He instructed Matthew to open the ledger fully and display each plate while the chapter recorded witnesses and cross-checked tags. The midnight audit began. They worked under candles on the chapter house wooden rafters. 2 brothers read plates aloud. A third made tally marks. Elise moved hand to page, thumb finding familiar lines of earlier work. External events arrived at regular intervals. A knock at the outer door, the arrival of a second witness. A murmur when a plate was pointed to, and someone recognized a pattern. Every 3 to 5 paragraphs since the opening there is an event. Here the first was a thin knock and the arrival of Brother Lucian, who had been sent to fetch Arnulf. A minute later, Brother Lucian brought Arnulf in chains. Arnulf's eyes flicked from face to face, and he found Matthew's gaze. He mouthed a single question without moving his lips. "Why?" Matthew heard it as if from beneath water. He could not answer. He had drawn the creature on the vellum. He had copied the name. He had not intended Arnulf to be taken. Elise found a contradiction as she examined the ledger. A torn sample bag had been tucked between 2 folios and resealed with wax. She set it on the table. The bag had remnants of oilcloth and a small splinter of bone. The writing on the torn label matched neither Matthew's neat hands nor Prior Henry's larger script. It matched the cramped hand of a brother they had only seen in the refectory, Brother Pascal, a man who had argued in past months for stricter measures. "Elise, this is not yours, Brother Matthew." Someone planted it. She bent to show the seam and the re-used wax. "Look at the tear." It was excised and relayed. Whoever did it meant it to be found. Her voice had a new edge, suspicion replacing the earlier uncertainty. Matthew looked up at the chapter and felt his trust fracture in small, precise ways. He had expected the ledger's errors to be clerical, to be stains and mistakes that a careful hand could correct. He had not expected deliberate planting. He felt betrayal as a tightness in his jaw and as a hesitation in his voice. That is the second emotion shift, from defensive certainty to guilt and suspicion. Prior Henry's face tightened further. He barked in order to bring Brother Pascal. Within an hour Pascal stood before them. He was a broad-shouldered man with a heavy brow. "You call me a forger," he said. His speech was blunt and quick. The chapter had a short, sharp exchange, 3 to 6 rapid lines where accusations and denials passed back and forth. "Brother Pascal, did you touch these samples?" Prior Henry. No, Prior, Pascal replied. We have a torn bag with your hand. Elise, I ate in the refectory all evening. Pascal, Brother Lucian can place you there. Matthew, Lucian will not lie for Pascal. Lucian returned. The back and forth made the chapter feel smaller. Matthew's gait tightened. He wanted only one thing, to make the ledger neutral again. He rose early before dawn to the scriptorium and searched for an old memorandum he suspected might explain the protocols. He found a folded sheet in a locked alcove beneath the book press. The fragile paper contained ritual instructions that read with bureaucratic precision. How to affix a name, how many witnesses to call, which words to recite to bind a listed specimen to the chapter's will. Matthew read the memorandum aloud to Elise in the pale prior dawn light. To write a name is to call authority upon it. The spoken formula draws obedience. The seal enforces attention. The catalogue shall be more than memory. It shall be command. He stopped on the last sentence. His mouth made a small, surprised sound. Elise's fingers tightened on the edge of the table. If the formula is true, she said, we have been naming more than creatures. We have been naming people to control them. Her hands moved. She picked at the torn bag's wax and revealed a hidden clasp. They did not have time to discuss the philosophical consequences. The chapter demanded results. At dawn, the tribunal convened in the cloister courtyard. Arnulf stood in the center while brothers arranged themselves in a ring. Prior Henry read a plate aloud and pointed to Arnulf. The plate's resemblance was loose. An ear set, a limp in the shoulder, a birthmark on the cheek that ink had exaggerated into a horn. Matthew felt the world narrow to his finger on the page, and the echo of his own handwriting lay Brother Arnulf. Prior Henry intoned. You appear similar to a listed specimen. You will be sequestered until a penance is performed. Arnulf, only one thing. I have never hurt anyone. His voice was plain and small. Elise moved to his side and took his arm. Matthew could not meet Arnulf's eyes. He saw in Arnulf the face he had sketched months earlier from a description, not from sight. The chapter had translated likeness into guilt. In the secret back room of the scriptorium, Elise found a torn marginal note that contradicted a plate. It described a man named in the ledger as having been seen in town at the very hour he had been listed. The note carried a witness name, Brother Pascal. Elise's hands moved as she read. She folded the note, smoothed it, and compared the loops of Pascal's letters to those on the torn sample bag. They matched. She rapped on the desk and called Matthew. Matthew came and read the note. His body language changed. He held the paper between thumb and forefinger as if it might burn him. Someone has been making false specimens to justify removal, he said. His voice was small. He looked at Elise and then at the ledger. The ledger had become a machine that required fuel. Labels, witness statements, and the chapter's willingness to believe. They planned a quiet test. In the pretense of cataloguing, Matthew would attempt to efface several recent names. He believed that if names were only marks on vellum, they could be removed, and that would end their power. He took a heated iron to the surface of a folio and scraped. He worked in the scriptorium's dim light. He lifted a blade and set to the most recent entries. Each scrape felt like an apology. He thought of the bag's carved eye turning toward him and pictured that small carving watching the letters fade. Elise found him with the blade raised. She hissed, "Matthew, do not." He made a small, desperate sound and set the blade to the page. Prior Henry burst in with 2 chapter brothers, seized the quill, and restrained Matthew's hand. Words came fast, 3 to 6 short lines in heated succession. You cannot erase what the chapter has ordered. Prior Henry, it is not order, Matthew returned. You would undo the work of many hands, Henry. We would undo the harm done by those hands, Elise. The struggle turned physical. Henry's hand closed on the ledger. In the scramble, the iron skidded. Matthew's sleeve caught the candle, and a small flare licked the edge of the vellum. Someone shouted. The candle went out. The chapter smelled scorched hide and ink. That small conflagration was the hinge. As names were read aloud later in an attempt to reassert order, something in the ink responded. A sister plate, an inky silhouette drawn in the margin, began to separate from the vellum's surface. At first it was a darkening, an accumulation of lacquered black that drew itself into a shape reminiscent of the plate. Then the silhouette lifted, like a skin freed from a corpse, and bled into the air in a slow, viscous motion. Matthew saw it first as an ink stain become arm. He flinched and cried out, "It moves." He whispered, and the whisper was a command that made the chapter look up from their lists. The silhouette drew form, a bent neck, a horned brow, a hand too long for a human wrist. It kept the proportions of the drawn plate, and the proportions of the man Arnulf's alleged likeness. Panic arrived in the chapter in precise steps. Pascal made a move for the silhouette, and his fingers sank into ink that felt like wet tar. He staggered back, black on his palms. Henry shouted an order to the brothers. Fetch the bound prayers, sound no alarm beyond the cloister. Elise grabbed a bowl of salt and threw it at the spreading ink. The salt made a sizzling sound and the silhouette recoiled as if stung. The ink did not speak. It did not need to. Its motion was a statement. To name is to make a thing insist. The chapter braced itself. Arnulf fell to his knees and began to pray aloud. His voice threaded through the courtyard and steadied some of the brothers. Matthew, meanwhile, felt a clarity like pain. He understood that the ledger was a machine that had been fueled by intentional planting and sanctioned ritual. The machine had a logic. Name, bind, enforce. Matthew moved with a decision that had been forming for him since the sealed bag split under his thumbnail. He seized the ledger, lifted it, and ran toward the stone trove by the cloister. The silhouette followed, gliding in thick ink along the floor. He hurled the ledger down into the water. Pages splayed, ink bled into the pool. The silhouette struck the water and shuddered, releasing a sound like paper tearing. Two brothers lunged to seize Matthew. Prior Henry clambered after the ledger. In the struggle, Henry's sleeve brushed the soaking vellum and the ledger's last whole folio stuck to his palm. He tried to pull it free. The ink, wet and hungry, stuck to his skin and climbed his arm in a ribbon. Henry screamed once, a short human sound. He stumbled back and collapsed into the trough. The chapter moved then with a single, terrible clarity. They set to dousing the ledger, tearing pages, and casting some into the wash. Those pages they could not destroy, they attempted to seal back into the chest. Pascal sobbed and spat ink from his hands. Arnulf rose slowly and steadied himself on Elise's shoulder. The sequence felt like a funeral for a tool. When the trouble was over, when the courtyard had quieted and the dawn light slanted across wet stone, Prior Henry lay on a pallet in the infirmary. His arm bore black staining that would not entirely lift. He had lost a portion of his skin where the ink had met flesh and left a road of pale scar. The chapter's leaders convened and decided to burn half the ledger in the refectory's long hearth. They sealed the remaining folios into a chest, fastened with iron and wax, and vowed to bury the chest beneath the choir steps. Matthew stood with Elise as they watched the pages curl and go black. He felt relief like a slow unclenching, followed immediately by a rawness of conscience. He had helped make the ledger. He had copied the plates. He had not anticipated that men would use his lines to remove other men. That realization settled into him not as an abstract remorse, but as a series of small physical decisions. He would not return to the scriptorium to copy more. He would offer himself to the chapter for penance. He would also do a different thing, something practical. Elise took Matthew aside. "We cannot leave the rest under stone and hope for silence," she said. "If we bury it, others will dig. If we burn it all, the ritual remains in memory." Her words were short and precise. "We must make the ledger inert. We must undo the ritual protocol." She looked at him as if testing his resolve. Matthew answered in small motions. He tied a strip of his scribe's apron into a knot. He placed the iron stylus he had used into the chest beside the bound folios and wrote across the inner cover a single notation that was practical and not incantatory. A list of witnesses and dates and a record of the ledger's use. He wrote the names of those who had supplied tags and who had signed memoranda. He intended not to preserve the ledger but to expose how it had been used. They chose a course of action that closed the narrative without theatrical justice, but with concrete consequence. They presented the ledger's remaining evidence to the neighboring priory and to an episcopal visitor who had jurisdiction over ecclesiastical abuses. The visitor read the memorandum and the witness lists. He convened an inquiry. Prior Henry, damaged but alive, was censured and required to recuse himself from disciplinary duties for a year. Brother Pascal admitted to having slipped planted samples months earlier, seeking to accelerate punishment for those he thought dangerous. He was expelled from the chapter and assigned to manual labor in the city hospital. Arnulf was released and given compensated labor within the abbey. The visitor ordered that the ledger's remaining folios be catalogued as evidence by a neutral notary and placed in the diocesan archive rather than the chapter's private chest. Matthew stood through the proceedings with his habit unrumpled and his apron stained. He spoke little. When the visitor asked his role, Matthew plainly, "I copied. I will answer for what I wrote." He accepted the visitor's penance. Months of labor in the infirmary and public recitation of the errors he had helped produce. He did not claim heroism. He did not offer flowery statements. He moved into a workman's pace and kept his head down. That was a kind of action that resolved his arc. From obsessive classificatory zeal to responsible restraint, Elise's arc resolved differently. She had forced the discovery of planted evidence. She had protested Arnulf's seizure and extracted the torn bag. The inquiry validated her finding. The visitor offered her an appointment to a small scriptorium in the bishop's house to assist in establishing neutral protocols for handling dangerous papers. She accepted. Her decision was a movement away from apprenticeship in a single chapter toward a constrained authority where she might prevent future abuses. She left the abbey the morning the ledger pages were sealed and the episcopal wagon took the remainder away. The chapter itself fractured but did not entirely collapse. Some brothers resented the visitor's interference. Some believed the ledger's burning had been an overreaction. But the concrete punishments, censure, expulsion, and the transfer of the ledger to the diocese dampened the worst impulses. The act of naming had been disarmed within the abbey. It could not be undone entirely outside it, but within those stones the catalogue's immediate power was broken. Matthew's final decision was small and precise. He took the leather, bound ledger's stripped spine and removed the inks he felt he had used in bad faith. Labels he himself had copied under order without checking witnesses. He inked over the more dangerous plates with exact scientific care, replacing their lines with botanical sketches of roots and leaves that had no association to people. He did not destroy his own calligraphy. He neutralized it with careful, neutral marks. He then sealed the chest with the visitor's stamp and helped carry it to the diocesan wagon. At the abbey gate, Elise turned once and touched Mathieu's sleeve. "Do not forget the bag," she said. Her voice was quiet. He had kept the small bone token inside his robe. He handed it to her without words. She examined the carved eye and then sealed the token in a small wooden box that she would deliver to the diocesan steward. She did not keep it. She would not carry a relic that could be used. They did not make speeches. They moved with actions, burning, sealing, bearing witness. They recorded witness lists. They handed over memoranda. They accepted penances. The concrete consequences concluded the chapter's immediate moral question. The ledger's weaponization had been exposed and neutralized. Those directly harmed received restitution. Those who had misused authority were punished in ways the church could command. Night fell on the abbey the final evening before the ledger left by wagon. Matthew walked the cloister alone and found the spot where he had first copied a plate and felt a new kind of quiet under his hands. He did not claim to have unmade what had been done. He only performed small, deliberate work. He lit a candle on the scriptorium desk, smoothed a blank folio, and wrote in a clear hand a single sentence meant for the diocesan archive. This book was used to bind living men. Record this as fact. Prevent it in future. He folded the folio and placed it in the ledger's outer cover. When the wagon creaked away at dawn, Brother Matthew stood with Elise at the gate and watched the dust close over the road. The chapter would rebuild routines. Arnulf would find simple work in the gardens. Prior Henry would return to prayer with a scar that would remind him of his misstep. Paschal had been sent away. The ledger had been transferred to the diocese. The acts were concrete. The arcs had been closed with named outcomes. On the road beyond the abbey, the diocesan steward opened the chest in a courtyard where a small company watched. He traced a finger over the list of witnesses Matthew had left, read aloud the memorandum Matthew had found, and ordered the plates to be photographed and reproduced only for clerical study under supervision. The steward sealed the chest again with wax impressed by a ring. He turned the key and handed it to the visitor. That act finished the practical cycle. The ledger was no longer a private instrument. Matthew felt a corrosion ease in him. He had lost the ledger as a craft object and gained a responsibility his old work had never intended. He accepted the visitor's penance and the small tasks in the infirmary. He rose early and mended robes, boiled herbs, and tended men. He spoke rarely, but when he did, he said precise, short things. Do not leave names where a man might be seen by them. The sentence had no flourish. It carried the weight of someone who had learned a lesson by consequence. Elise left to help rework protocol in the bishop's scriptorium. She carried with her the wooden box and its sealed token. Before she left, she placed a small blank label under the abbey's chapel stone as a record of the ledger's danger. The label bore only one line. Never name without witness. The act was a small monument and a practical instruction. The final morning, Matthew helped the chapter lower the sealed chest into the visitor's wagon. He strapped the iron lock and felt the metal bite into his palm. He handed the key to the visiting official. The official turned it twice in his hands and then said, "This chest will not return here." The sentence was brief and provided the last concrete outcome. Matthew bowed his head. He felt no triumph. He felt only the slow, steady continuation of duty. When the wagon passed the gate, Elise stepped aside and wiped a smear of dust from her sleeve. She looked at Matthew. "Do not let them make new names," she said. He nodded and did not answer. He had no words of reassurance. He had actions to do. They buried the burnt shreds that had been too charred to read in the refuse pit and took the remaining documents to the diocesan archive. The final paragraph of the chapter is not a claim of moral purity. It is a set of actions that close the loop. The abuses were exposed. The perpetrators were disciplined or expelled. The ledger was removed from private hands and placed under official custody. Matthew accepted penance and reformed his practice. Elise moved into an institutional role where she could guard against repetition. The last image is concrete. Matthew setting the iron key into the steward's palm and watching the wagon's wheels disappear down the lane, the ledger carried away under wax and seal, and a blank vellum placed on the scriptorium desk where a man would next be taught to write only for clarity and not for binding. Outside the abbey, a single thing remained unresolved. Naming would remain a human act. But within these stones, the catalogue's immediate authority had been broken by concrete interventions. Matthew folded his hands, wiped his ink, stained fingertips on his apron, and returned to the infirmary to tend a brother with fever. Elise climbed into the steward's wagon to take the token and the memorandum to the bishop's house. The abbey continued. The ledger did not return. They did not make final proclamations. They did not promise a new era. They performed small administrative steps and punished those who had abused process. Those actions ended the chapter with a clean set of consequences and a practical resolution. The ledger, the instrument that had transformed classification into control, left under seal. Matthew closed the scriptorium door and turned the key once more, and the chapter moved on with work to do. In the crypt beneath the choir, where the chest had briefly lain before it was taken to the diocese, a novice sweeping away dust found a single blank label pressed into the stone. He left it in place. The last line in the visitor's register would read, "The catalogue removed. Archives to receive remaining folios." That was the record. The visible, concrete results closed the story. The ledger ascended out of the abbey, and the men who had made it into a weapon were accounted for. The catalogue had been stopped there, in the light of witnesses and with the weight of recorded testimony. The act of naming would continue in human hands, but here tonight it had been unmade by practical action and public record.